During the scramble for Africa, every kingdom, every empire, every nation on the continent fell to European conquest. An ancient empire in the highlands of East Africa that looked at the most powerful colonial force on earth and said no. Not with words, with 100,000 warriors, with rifles, with artillery, with a genius of a king who had been preparing for this moment for years. On the 1st of March, 1896, near the small Ethiopian town of Adwa, something happened that sent shockwaves from Rome to London to Washington to every corner of the earth where African people lived under the shadow of colonial rule. Africa struck back, and Europe would never forget it. Italy had arrived late to the colonial feast. By the 1880s, Britain controlled vast African territories. France dominated the West. Germany had carved out its share. Belgium had claimed the Congo. Italy had almost nothing. For a country desperate to prove itself a serious European power, colonies were not a luxury. They were a necessity, a matter of national pride and political survival. So Italy looked at the map of Africa and found what it thought was an easy target: Ethiopia, an ancient Christian empire that had existed for over 1,000 years. A highland kingdom whose rulers traced their lineage back to the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. A nation that had survived centuries of invasion and internal conflict and still stood. Italy did not see history. Italy saw opportunity. In 1889, Emperor Johannes IV of Ethiopia died in battle against Sudanese forces. The throne passed to a regional king named Sahle Mariam, who took the imperial name Menelik II. Italy saw their moment. They supported Menelik's claim to the throne. They offered him weapons, money, and recognition. And in exchange, they asked him to sign a treaty, the Treaty of Wuchale. Menelik signed it, but here is what Italy did not know. The treaty existed in two versions, one in Italian, one in Amharic, the language of Ethiopia. The Italian version stated that Ethiopia was obligated to conduct all its foreign relations through Italy. That made Ethiopia an Italian protectorate, a dependency, a colony in everything but name. The Amharic version said something entirely different. It said Ethiopia could, if it chose, use Italian diplomatic channels. Not that it had to. Could. One word. The difference between independence and subjugation. Whether this was an honest mistranslation or a deliberate deception, historians still debate. But the effect was clear. Italy immediately told every European power that Ethiopia was now an Italian protectorate. When Menelik discovered what the Italian version actually said, he was furious. He had taken their weapons and their gold. He had never agreed to give them his country. In 1893, Menelik formally renounced the Treaty of Wuchale. He wrote to the kings and emperors of Europe, declaring Ethiopia a free and sovereign nation that had never submitted to Italian authority. Italy ignored him. But here is what Italy did not know while they were ignoring him. Menelik had been preparing. For years, quietly, systematically, and with extraordinary patience, he had been building an army unlike anything Ethiopia had ever fielded before. He bought rifles from France and Russia, tens of thousands of modern rifles, better rifles in many cases than what the Italian soldiers carried. He acquired artillery pieces. He stockpiled ammunition. He trained his commanders. He had also done something even more important. He had united Ethiopia. When he called his people to war in 1895, they came from every corner of the empire. Farmers and nobles, warriors and priests, veterans of a dozen previous campaigns, all of them answering the call of their emperor. 100,000 soldiers assembled under the Ethiopian flag. Italy was expecting to fight a primitive army of spear carriers. They were about to meet something very different. In the autumn of 1895, Italian Prime Minister Francesco Crispi ordered the invasion. General Oreste Baratieri led his force south from the Italian colony of Eritrea into Ethiopian territory. He had approximately 17,000 men, modern weapons, artillery, the full confidence of a European military establishment that had never seriously considered the possibility of defeat at African hands. His early progress seemed to justify that confidence. Small Ethiopian forces in the north fell back before the Italian advance. Italian newspapers celebrated. Crispi sent triumphant telegrams. The mood in Rome was of imminent victory. Then Menelik moved. His full army, 100,000 strong, began marching north to meet the Italians. The march itself was an extraordinary logistical achievement. 600 miles across the Ethiopian highlands. Men, women, and children moving together. Empress Taytu, the wife of Menelik, marching alongside her husband, commanding her own force of soldiers and cavalry. Baratieri saw the intelligence reports about the size of the force moving toward him, and wanted to retreat. Any sane commander would have. But Crispi sent furious telegrams from Rome. Italy's honor was at stake. Colonial ambitions could not be derailed by cautious generals. Attack! End this war! On the night of the 29th of February 1896, Baratieri ordered his army forward. The plan was to advance in 3 columns under cover of darkness. Occupy the mountain passes above Adwa before dawn. Force Menelik's army to attack on Italian terms from disadvantageous ground. The maps were wrong. Catastrophically wrong. The Italian columns moved through unfamiliar terrain in darkness, following maps that did not accurately represent the landscape they were crossing. The columns lost contact with each other almost immediately. One column marched too far to the left. Another fell behind. The third ended up on a completely different route from where it was supposed to be. When dawn broke on the 1st of March, the 3 Italian columns were scattered across the Ethiopian highlands, miles apart from each other, unable to see each other, unable to communicate, unable to provide mutual support. Ethiopian scouts had tracked their movement through the night. Menelik knew exactly where they were. He knew they were separated. He struck immediately. What happened next was not one battle, but 3. 3 simultaneous engagements in 3 different parts of the hills around Adwa, as 100,000 Ethiopian soldiers fell on the isolated Italian columns before they could regroup. The first Italian column to be engaged was commanded by General Vittorio da Bormida. His men found themselves suddenly under devastating fire from Ethiopian positions on the heights above them. Rifles cracked from the hillsides. Artillery thundered. Italian soldiers fell in waves, unable to advance into the fire and unable to retreat through the terrain behind them. Then the Ethiopian infantry charged. Thousands of warriors poured down the mountainside, with rifles firing and blades drawn. Da Bormida's column, isolated, outnumbered, and trapped, was overwhelmed. Da Bormida himself was killed. His column ceased to exist as a fighting force within hours of the battle beginning. The second column, under General Giuseppe Armandi, fared no better. Mass assaults from multiple directions. Ethiopian cavalry circling the flanks. Ammunition running low. Panic spreading through the ranks. The third column, attempting to withdraw, was funneled into a narrow ravine. Ethiopian cavalry descended on them from above. It became a slaughter. Officers died alongside their men in the narrow passage, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. By early afternoon, it was over. 7,000 Italian and Eritrean soldiers lay dead on the hills around Adwa. 3,000 more were taken prisoner. The survivors ran. Baratieri himself fled north toward Eritrea, pursued by Ethiopian cavalry. The guns, the supplies, the artillery, the ammunition, everything the Italians had brought into Ethiopia to conquer it, was left behind on the hillsides, as men too frightened to carry anything ran for their lives. When the news reached Rome, the reaction was immediate and violent. Riots erupted in the streets. Mobs attacked government buildings. Francesco Crispi's government collapsed. Italy, the nation that had gone to war to prove it was a great European power, had suffered one of the most humiliating defeats in the entire history of European colonialism. In October 1896, Italy signed the Treaty of Addis Ababa. It was a complete and unconditional surrender. Italy formally recognized the full sovereignty and independence of Ethiopia. Every claim of a protectorate was abandoned. Every pretense that the Treaty of Wuchale had given Italy authority over Ethiopian foreign policy was dropped. Italy had gone to Africa to make Ethiopia a colony. It came home having formally acknowledged that Ethiopia was free. The reaction beyond Italy was extraordinary. Across Africa, every kingdom, every people that was living under colonial rule or fighting colonial conquest heard what had happened at Adwa. Across the African diaspora, in the Caribbean, in the Americas, in every part of the world where people of African descent lived, the news arrived like lightning. An African army had defeated a European colonial force, not in a minor skirmish, not through some accident of terrain and weather, but in a full-scale battle with overwhelming, decisive force. Menelik's victory forced every European power to recognize Ethiopia as a sovereign, independent state. Ethiopia sent representatives to international conferences. It maintained diplomatic relations with European governments as an equal. It was the only African nation, besides Liberia, to enter the 20th century with its independence formally recognized by the world. When the Pan-African movement began gathering force in the early 20th century, Adwa was part of its foundation. When African nations began achieving independence in the 1950s and 1960s, the green, gold, and red of the Ethiopian flag became a symbol of liberation, adopted by more than a dozen newly independent African states in tribute to the country that had proven African sovereignty was possible. When the Rastafarian movement emerged in Jamaica in the 1930s, it looked to Ethiopia and to the successors of Menelik II as symbols of African dignity and divine purpose, precisely because Ethiopia had stood when everything else had fallen. Adwa did not just win a battle. Adwa changed what Africa believed was possible. If you watch this video to the end, please make sure you subscribe to my channel.